That afternoon, two men spoke words they'd never say on camera and never would again. The studio was cold that day, not unusual for NBC Burbank in November. The air conditioning ran year-round, engineered for the heat of stage lights that wouldn't come on for another 3 hours. But on November 14th, 1973, the chill felt different, deliberate. Like the building itself was holding its breath. Dean Martin arrived at 2:47 p.m. Early. For anyone else, unremarkable. For Dean, it was unheard of. The call time was 4:30. He was known, affectionately professionally, for cutting it close. 5 minutes before airtime was his signature. It was part of the persona, effortlessly cool, perpetually unbothered, as if excellence required no preparation. But that day he walked through the backstage entrance 93 minutes ahead of schedule. The guard at the desk looked up, hesitated, checked his watch. Dean nodded, didn't smile. Kept walking. His shoes echoed down the corridor, Italian leather on linoleum, a sound that belonged in a different kind of building. He carried nothing, no script, no drink. His hands were in his pockets. Studio One was half lit, work lights only. The famous curtain hung limp and colorless without the stage glow. The guest chairs sat empty, positioned at precise angles that would look casual on camera, but were marked with tape on the floor. Everything was ready. Nothing was alive yet. Johnny Carson was already there. He stood near his desk, not sitting, one hand resting on the back of his chair. He wore a dark suit, no tie yet. His posture was straighter than it would be later, when the cameras rolled and he'd adopt that characteristic lean, the body language of a man perpetually amused, perpetually in control. But now, in the empty studio, he looked like someone waiting for news he didn't want to hear. Dean stopped at the edge of the set. For a moment, neither man moved. "You're early?" Johnny said. "So are you." It wasn't banter. There was no lilt to it, no setup for a punchline. Just two statements of fact, delivered in the flatness of men who'd spent decades perfecting the art of sounding like they meant something else. Johnny gestured toward the guest chair. Dean walked over, sat down. The chair was positioned for the camera, angled slightly away from Johnny's desk. In the empty studio, it felt wrong. Like sitting for a portrait no one was painting. Johnny remained standing. "Technical delay," he said. "Something with the soundboard. They're saying 20 minutes, maybe 30. Dean nodded. He'd been doing this long enough to know that 20 minutes meant 40, and 40 meant the rest of the afternoon. The machinery of television was precise until it wasn't, and when it failed, everyone waited. But no one had called Dean early. He'd come on his own. Somewhere in the booth above them, a red light blinked. Not recording, just standby, the patient glow of equipment waiting to be told what to do. A technician moved behind the glass, adjusting something. His movements were slow, careful, no urgency. Johnny finally sat, not at his desk, in the chair beside Dean, the guest's chair, the one he never occupied. He leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and for the first time in the 7 years they'd known each other, they sat side by side, facing the same direction, toward an audience that wasn't there. "Hell of a year," Johnny said. Dean didn't respond immediately. He was looking at the curtain, or past it, toward the space where 300 people would sit in a few hours and laugh on cue and applaud at the right moments. The machinery of joy, calibrated and reliable. "Yeah," Dean said finally. "Hell of a year." It had been. For the country, Watergate hearings, Vietnam still bleeding, an oil crisis that turned gas stations into battlegrounds. The world felt fractured, unmoored, like someone had changed the rules without warning, and everyone was pretending they'd known all along. For Dean, his son Dino Jr. killed in March, his fighter jet disappearing into a mountain in California. 24 years old, a boy who'd wanted to be his own man, to do something that mattered beyond the name he carried. Gone in a moment that defied comprehension. The public mourning had been brief, respectful. Dean had released a statement. The press had given him space. He'd returned to work within weeks, because that's what men did. That's what professionals did. The show continued because the show always continued. But everyone who knew him saw the difference, not in his performances. Those remained flawless, the timing, the ease, the illusion of a man unburdened, but in the spaces between. The moments when the camera wasn't on him. The way he stood a little further from groups. The way conversations seemed to reach him on a delay, as if traveling through water. Johnny had seen it. He'd mentioned it once, carefully, after a taping in June. Asked if Dean was all right. Dean had smiled, that smile, the one that could sell anything, and said he was fine. Johnny had nodded and never asked again, because that was the agreement. You didn't push. You didn't pry. You respected the performance, on camera and off, especially among men whose entire value was constructed on the appearance of imperviousness. But now in the cold studio, with no audience and no cameras, or so they believed, something was different. I keep thinking about a night in '58, Dean said. Johnny turned slightly, waiting. We were in Vegas. Some charity thing. Sinatra organized it. You weren't there yet. You were still doing Who Do You Trust in New York. But it was the whole circus. Dino was 12, maybe 13. He wanted to see the show. Jean said no, too late, school night, even though we were in Vegas. Dean's voice was even, factual, like he was describing a scene from someone else's life. I snuck him in, told him to stay in the wings, don't let your mother see, and he stood there the whole show, watching. Afterwards, he asked me how we made it look so easy. All of it, the jokes, the timing, the way Frank could have a whole room in his pocket without even trying. Johnny didn't interrupt. I told him it was practice, thousands of hours, that nobody's born knowing how to make people laugh. You have to build it, brick by brick, and he looked at me like I'd explained how a magic trick worked. Disappointed, like he'd wanted it to be something else, something, I don't know, more. The technician in the booth was gone now. The studio was utterly silent except for the low hum of the air system, that constant mechanical breathing that never stopped. He joined the Air National Guard because he wanted to do something that wasn't performance, Dean continued. Something where the skill was the skill, no masks, just you and the machine and the physics of staying in the air. He stopped. The sentence hung there, unfinished. Johnny leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. His hands were clasped, and for a moment he studied them as if they belonged to someone else. My father sold electrical supplies, Johnny said quietly. Went to work every day in a tie. Came home at 5:47, same time, every single evening. Ate dinner, read the paper, went to bed. For 30 years. When he retired, they gave him a watch. 2 months later, he had a stroke. Died before he could figure out what to do with the time. Dean looked at him, but Johnny kept his eyes on his hands. I used to think about that when I took this job, Johnny continued. How I'd become the thing people turned on when they wanted to forget their day. The reliable presence. The same time, same place. And I wondered if that was enough. If that mattered. If I'd get to the end and someone would hand me a watch, and I'd realize I'd spent 30 years being a good employee. It's not the same, Dean said. No, Johnny agreed. It's bigger, which somehow makes it worse. Neither man was performing now. There was no audience to charm, no camera to play to, no producer to satisfy. Just two men in their 40s, wildly successful, universally admired, professionally invincible, sitting in an empty room, talking about the things success had cost them. You know what nobody tells you, Dean said. When you build something that works, a persona, a brand, whatever the hell we call it, it becomes its own thing. People need it. They depend on it. And you can't just stop. You can't say, actually, I'm tired. Actually, this hurts. Actually, I don't know if I have it in me tonight, because that's not the agreement. What is the agreement? Johnny asked. Dean was quiet for a long moment. That we're fine, he said finally. That nothing touches us. That the world can be falling apart and we'll walk out there and make it okay for 90 minutes. And if we can't, then we fake it. Johnny nodded slowly. He understood. Of course he understood. He'd built an entire career on the same foundation, the appearance of effortless command, the sense that nothing rattled him, that he could navigate any moment with a quip and a smile. But the truth, the one they both knew and never said, was that maintaining that appearance required a kind of constant vigilance that wore you down in ways no one could see. Every interview was a tightrope, every joke a calculation, every personal question a potential landmine. And you couldn't complain, because complaining suggested weakness, and weakness violated the fundamental contract of masculinity in 1973. You endured. Silently, competently, without burdening others with the weight of your private struggles. I haven't been sleeping, Johnny said suddenly. It was an admission so stark, so uncharacteristic that Dean actually turned to look at him fully, continued. I lie there and my mind just runs. Through every show, every joke that didn't land quite right, every guest who gave me a look I couldn't read, every piece of mail from someone saying I'm not what I used to be, that I've lost it, that I should step aside. You're at the top, Dean said. I know, that's the problem. There's nowhere to go but down. And I keep thinking about when that happens, how I'll know, if I'll see it coming or if everyone else will see it first. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You spend your whole life climbing, and then one day you're at the summit, and you realize the only story left is the descent. Dean absorbed this. He knew the feeling. Not about decline. His career was still robust, still lucrative, but about the awareness that time was finite, that every choice narrowed the path ahead, that the version of yourself you'd become might not be the version you'd have chosen if you'd known the cost. Dino used to ask me why I drank so much, Dean said. It wasn't a non sequitur. Johnny understood immediately. On camera, it was part of the act, the lovable lush, the guy who could have 5 martinis and still hit every note. People loved it. It was safe, funny, harmless. Dean's voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. Off camera, it was different. It was, I don't know, a way to turn the noise down, to make the gap between who I was and who I was supposed to be a little less loud. Did you tell him that? No, I told him it was part of the job, that people expected it, that disappointment was worse than playing along. The silence that followed was heavy. Do you think he believed you? Johnny asked. I think he wanted to. Above them, the red standby light continued its patient blinking. In the booth, a second technician had appeared, conferring with the first. They worked slowly, methodically. There was no crisis, just the routine maintenance of machinery that needed to function perfectly when the moment came. Johnny rubbed his face with both hands. When he lowered them, he looked older. Not dramatically, just the small, undeniable evidence of accumulated years. I got a letter last week, he said, from a guy in Ohio, said he'd watched the show every night for 8 years, that it was the one thing he and his father did together before his father passed, and he wanted me to know that it mattered, that I'd given them something. He paused, and I read it and I felt nothing. Not gratitude, not pride, just this weight, like he'd handed me another brick to carry. Dean understood. The praise was real. The impact was real. But when you'd spent decades being the source of other people's comfort, there was a kind of exhaustion that set in, a resentment you couldn't express because expressing it would make you seem ungrateful. Selfish. Small. I used to think this would be enough, Dean said quietly. The success, the applause, the sense that I'd made it, that I'd beaten the odds. Kid from Steubenville, couldn't speak English till I was 5, ends up with his name in lights. And now I think about what I gave up to get here, and I'm not sure the math works out. It was the most honest thing either of them had said to another person in months, maybe years. They sat in silence, not the awkward silence of men who didn't know each other, not the companionable silence of friends who didn't need to fill space, but the silence of 2 people who'd stumbled into a clearing they hadn't known existed, a place where the performance could stop, where the weight could be set down, even if just for a moment. You think it gets easier? Johnny asked. No, Dean said. I think we just get better at pretending it does. Johnny nodded. He'd suspected as much. Somewhere far off, a door opened and closed. Voices in the hallway, crew members arriving, the slow assembly of the team that would transform this cold, empty space into a living piece of television. The machine was warming up. Soon it would need to be fed. Johnny stood first. He straightened his jacket, ran a hand through his hair. Small, automatic adjustments, the reflex of a man who knew he'd be seen soon. Dean stood as well. For a moment they faced each other. Not the way they would later when the cameras rolled and they'd trade quips and charm a studio audience. But as they were, 2 men in their 40s, exhausted, successful, trapped by the very thing they'd worked their entire lives to build. You gonna be all right? Johnny asked. It was the same question he'd asked in June, but this time, Dean didn't smile. I don't know, he said. You? Johnny considered this. I don't know either. It wasn't despair, it wasn't defeat. It was just honesty, the rarest currency they had. Good talk, Dean said, and this time there was the faintest hint of his signature tone, the wry, self-aware warmth that had made him a star. Johnny almost smiled. Yeah, we should do this more often. They both knew they wouldn't. The door to the studio opened. A production assistant poked her head in, clipboard in hand. Oh, Mr. Carson, Mr. Martin, I didn't realize you were here already. We're still running behind, probably another 45 minutes. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? We're fine, Johnny said smoothly, just running through some ideas. Great, I'll let you know when we're ready. She disappeared. The door closed. Dean and Johnny looked at each other one more time. Something passed between them. Not a promise, not an agreement. Just the acknowledgement that they'd seen each other without the armor, and that neither would mention it again. Because that was the other agreement. What happened in the quiet moments stayed there. You didn't weaponize someone's honesty. You didn't turn vulnerability into gossip. You carried what they'd given you, and you pretended you didn't. Dean walked toward the exit. At the edge of the set, he paused and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're doing just fine. Johnny nodded. You too, Pally. Neither statement was entirely true, but it was the kindest lie they knew how to tell. Dean left. Johnny sat back down at his desk, not in the guest chair, in his chair, the one positioned at the center of everything. He straightened some papers that didn't need straightening, adjusted the pencil cup, performed the small rituals of a man preparing to be who he needed to be. In the booth above, a technician pressed a button. The red standby light flickered, reset. The system was coming back online. What neither man knew, what neither would know for years, was that the standby system had been running the entire time, not recording, not in any official sense, but logging. A backup feed, capturing audio in case something went wrong with the main system, and they needed to troubleshoot. 6 minutes and 43 seconds of conversation, stored on a tape that would sit in a file cabinet, unlabeled, unremarkable. Never reviewed because there was no reason to review it. Never erased because no one remembered it existed. A technician would find it years later after Johnny had retired, after Dean had passed, during a studio renovation when they were clearing out old equipment. He'd listen to the first 30 seconds, recognize the voices, and hesitate. Then he'd put it back in the box and mark it archive. Some things weren't meant to be broadcast. By 5:30 p.m., Studio One was fully alive. Lights blazed. The band played the familiar theme. The audience, 294 people who'd waited in line for hours, filled the seats and radiated the particular energy of people about to witness something special. Johnny walked through the curtain to thunderous applause. He smiled, waved, took his position behind the desk with the ease of a man who'd done this thousands of times. The opening monologue landed perfectly. The jokes hit. The audience loved him. At 6:03 p.m., he introduced his guest. My next guest needs no introduction, but I'm contractually obligated to give him one anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Dean Martin. Dean walked through the curtain. Impeccable suit, easy smile. That walk, the loose, confident stride of a man who owned every room he entered. The audience erupted. He sat in the guest chair. Johnny leaned back in his. The familiar choreography began. Dean, you're looking good. What's your secret? Clean living, Johnny. 8 hours of sleep, plenty of vegetables, no late nights. You're a terrible liar. I know. That's why I stick to singing. The audience laughed. The banter flowed. They discussed Dean's new album, his upcoming shows in Vegas, a funny story about Frank Sinatra that may or may not have been true. It was effortless, polished, exactly what everyone expected. At no point did either man's expression flicker. At no point did the mask slip. When the segment ended and they cut to commercial, Dean leaned over and said something that made Johnny laugh. A genuine laugh, the kind that reached his eyes. The audience, released from the silence of broadcast, erupted into conversation. People turned to their neighbors, marveling at the chemistry between the two men, the ease of their friendship, the sense that they'd glimpsed something real. And they had, just not the part they thought. The taping wrapped at 7:52 p.m. Dean stayed for the final segment, joined by the other guests for the panel discussion that would close the show. He was charming, generous with his laughs, made everyone around him look good. It was a masterclass in professionalism. When it was over, he shook Johnny's hand. They exchanged a few words, quiet, unremarkable. Then Dean headed backstage, signed a few autographs for the crew, and left through the same door he'd entered 4 hours earlier. Johnny stayed behind, as he always did, to record promos for the next week's shows. By the time he finished, the studio was mostly empty. Just a skeleton crew breaking down equipment, the slow dismantling of the world they'd built for 90 minutes. He walked to his dressing room alone. Inside, he loosened his tie, poured a drink, and sat in the chair facing the mirror. His reflection looked back at him, composed, successful, exactly the man millions of people believed him to be. He raised the glass in a silent toast to no one in particular. Then he drank, and the night continued, and the machine rolled on toward tomorrow. Neither man ever mentioned that afternoon again. Not to each other, not to anyone else. It became one of those moments that exists in the space between memory and myth. Something that happened but was never acknowledged, never processed, never integrated into the official narrative of their friendship. But it changed things, in ways too subtle to measure. In future appearances, there was a different quality to the way they looked at each other. Not more affectionate, they'd always been warm on camera, but something underneath. A recognition. The knowledge that they'd each seen the other's exhaustion and hadn't turned away. It didn't fix anything. Dean's grief didn't lift. Johnny's insomnia didn't improve. The machinery of their careers continued to demand more than they had to give, and they continued to give it because that was the job. But for 6 minutes on a cold afternoon in November, two men had been honest with each other about the weight they carried. And for men of their generation, shaped by a culture that equated masculinity with silence, that was as close to intimacy as they knew how to get. Years later, when Johnny would occasionally mention Dean on air, after Dean had retreated from public life, after the years had taken their toll, there was always a pause, a moment where Johnny's face would do something complicated, something the audience might interpret as nostalgia, but was actually closer to grief. Not for Dean himself, who was still alive, but for the conversation they'd had once and never had again, for the door that had opened briefly and then closed and stayed closed because neither of them knew how to open it a second time without admitting how desperately they needed it to stay open. The tape sat in its box. The studio was renovated, then renovated again. Equipment came and went. Technologies changed. The Tonight Show continued with new hosts, new guests, new generations of audience members who didn't remember the particular magic of Johnny Carson, who'd never heard of Dean Martin, who lived in a world where men were told, sometimes, that they could admit exhaustion, could acknowledge pain, could ask for help without sacrificing dignity. But the tape remained, a ghost in the archive, a record of something true that was never meant to be witnessed. 6 minutes and 43 seconds of two men speaking without the armor they'd spent their entire lives constructing. It was, in its way, the most honest performance either of them ever gave, and no one ever saw it.